November 8, 1940. Luftwaffe High Command Headquarters, Berlin. The conference room smelled of coffee gone cold and cigarette smoke layered thick enough to sting the eyes. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring sat at the head of a table cluttered with tactical maps, intelligence reports, and photographs of bombed British cities. Around him sat a dozen officers from the Luftwaffe's technical and operational branches, men whose ranks and ribbons spoke of competence earned in Poland, France, and the Low Countries. They had gathered to address a problem that was becoming impossible to ignore. British bombers were reaching German industrial targets with increasing frequency, and the Reich's night defenses were failing to stop them. The meeting had been convened at the request of General Joseph Kammhuber, commander of the newly formed 12 Fliegerkorps, the Luftwaffe's night fighter command. Kammhuber was 45 years old, a career officer who had flown reconnaissance missions in the First World War and had spent the interwar years studying aerial tactics and defensive strategy. He was methodical, data-driven, and increasingly frustrated by what he considered willful blindness among his superiors. For 3 months, he had been submitting reports documenting the inadequacy of Germany's night fighter force. The numbers were undeniable. In September 1940, British Bomber Command had flown 1,673 sorties against German targets. German night fighters had shot down 12 bombers. A success rate of 0.7%. Kammhuber stood and addressed the room. He explained that the current system of night interception relied almost entirely on visual contact. Pilots flew patrols over designated zones, searching the darkness for the silhouette of an enemy bomber against clouds or moonlight. On nights with heavy cloud cover or no moon, interception became nearly impossible. The human eye, even aided by searchlights, could not reliably detect aircraft at the ranges and altitudes required for effective defense. The British understood this. They flew on the darkest nights, used cloud cover, scattered their formations to avoid concentrated searchlight zones, and employed electronic countermeasures that disrupted German radio navigation systems. The result was that most British bombers reached their targets, dropped their ordnance, and returned home without ever being engaged by a German fighter. Kammhuber proposed a solution. The Telefunken Company had developed a ground-based radar system designated Würzburg. The device could detect aircraft at ranges up to 40 kilometers and provide precise bearing and altitude information. If Würzburg radars were deployed along Germany's western approaches, they could guide night fighters directly to British bombers, eliminating the reliance on visual contact. Kammhuber had already conducted limited trials with prototype Würzburg sets in coordination with Messerschmitt Bf 110 night fighters. The results had been promising. In controlled tests, fighters equipped with radio direction from Würzburg operators had successfully intercepted target aircraft in complete darkness. The technology worked. What was needed now was authorization to mass-produce the radar and integrate it into a comprehensive defensive network. Göring listened to Kammhuber's presentation without interruption. When the general finished, the Reichsmarschall leaned back in his chair and lit another cigarette. He asked how many Würzburg sets Kammhuber estimated would be required to establish effective coverage. Kammhuber answered that an initial deployment of 200 radars positioned along the North Sea and Channel coasts would provide overlapping coverage sufficient to guide night fighters against incoming British raids. Each radar would be paired with a command bunker housing controllers who would track enemy bombers and direct fighters via radio. The system would require significant resources, trained operators, communication infrastructure, and coordination with flak artillery to ensure fighters were not engaged by friendly fire. But the technology existed. The doctrine had been tested. All that was missing was approval. Göring's response was immediate and dismissive. He stated that radar was an unproven technology, that British losses in daylight raids over the summer had proven the superiority of aggressive fighter tactics, and that the Luftwaffe's resources were better spent on offensive operations rather than defensive systems. He argued that night bombing by the British was a nuisance, not a strategic threat, and that German industrial production had not been significantly impacted. He concluded by saying that Kammhuber was overestimating the problem and that the Luftwaffe would continue to rely on experienced pilots and visual interception methods. The meeting was adjourned. Kammhuber left the conference room knowing that his proposal had been rejected not because of technical limitations or resource constraints, but because it contradicted Göring's understanding of air warfare. The Reichsmarschall believed in the offensive power of the Luftwaffe. He had built his reputation on the success of close air support during the invasions of Poland and France, and he was personally invested in the narrative that German air superiority had been achieved through pilot skill and aircraft performance. A defensive radar network implied that the Reich was vulnerable, that British bombers posed a genuine threat, and that the Luftwaffe needed to adopt a reactive rather than proactive posture. These were admissions Göring was unwilling to make, regardless of what the operational data suggested. Over the following months, British Bomber Command expanded its night operations. In December 1940, RAF bombers struck Mannheim, Düsseldorf, and Cologne. In January 1941, they hit Frankfurt, Stuttgart, and Berlin. In February, they attacked Hamburg and Kiel. The raids were not yet devastating in terms of tonnage dropped. British bomber technology in 1940 and early 1941 was limited by navigation difficulties and bomb aiming inaccuracies. But the psychological and political impact was significant. German civilians were experiencing air raids on their cities, something Göring had publicly promised would never happen. The Luftwaffe's failure to stop the bombers eroded confidence in the service and in the Reichsmarschall's leadership. Kammhuber continued to document the problem. His staff compiled monthly reports showing the number of British sorties, the number of interceptions attempted, and the number of confirmed kills. The data painted a clear picture. In the first 6 months of 1941, British Bomber Command flew over 8,000 sorties against German targets. German night fighters shot down fewer than 100 bombers. The success rate had improved slightly from the previous year, but it remained below 1.5%. Kammhuber calculated that at current rates, the Luftwaffe would need to destroy over 300 British bombers per month to inflict losses severe enough to force Bomber Command to suspend operations. With the existing visual interception system, that was impossible. In March 1941, Kammhuber received limited authorization to proceed with a small-scale deployment of Würzburg radars. Göring had not changed his position, but pressure from other senior officers and from the Reich Ministry of Armaments had forced a compromise. Kammhuber was permitted to establish a series of radar-guided night fighter zones along the Dutch and Belgian coasts. These zones, later known as Himmelbett positions, consisted of a single Würzburg radar, a command bunker, and a dedicated night fighter patrol area. Each zone covered approximately 30 kilometers of frontage. When British bombers entered a zone, the Würzburg radar would track them and a ground controller would direct the assigned fighter to intercept. The first Himmelbett zone became operational in April 1941 near the town of Arnhem in the Netherlands. The radar was a Würzburg C model, a dish-shaped antenna 7.5 meters in diameter mounted on a rotating platform. The radar transmitted pulses at 53 centimeters wavelength and received echoes reflected from aircraft. The returning signal was displayed on a cathode ray oscilloscope, showing the range and bearing of the target. An operator could determine the target's altitude by measuring the angle of elevation. The system was primitive by later standards, but it was functional. It could detect a bomber at 40 kilometers and track it continuously as it approached. The first successful radar-guided interception occurred on the night of April 15, 1941. A British Wellington bomber from No. 149 Squadron was detected by the Arnhem-Würzburg at 2,317 hours, approaching from the northwest at an altitude of 4,200 meters. The ground controller radioed a Bf-110 flown by Oberleutnant Ludwig Becker, one of Kammhuber's most experienced night fighter pilots. Becker was orbiting 20 kilometers south of Arnhem when he received the vector. The controller provided continuous updates on the bomber's position, speed, and heading. Becker adjusted his course, climbed to intercept altitude, and was guided to within 800 meters of the Wellington. At that distance, Becker's radar operator detected the bomber on the Bf-110's onboard Liechtenstein radar, a short-range airborne radar that had recently been installed in select night fighters. Becker closed to 200 meters, visually confirmed the target, and opened fire. The Wellington's port engine burst into flames. The bomber entered a steep dive and crashed into farmland outside Arnhem. All 5 crew members were killed. Kammhuber used this success to argue for expanded deployment of Würzburg radars. He presented the case to Luftwaffe High Command in May 1941, emphasizing that the Arnhem interception had been achieved in complete darkness with no moon and heavy cloud cover, conditions under which visual interception was impossible. The radar had detected the bomber at maximum range, the controller had directed the fighter precisely, and the pilot had made the kill. This was not luck. It was a repeatable system that could be scaled across the entire Western Defense Zone. The response from High Command was cautious approval. Kammhuber was authorized to expand the Himmelbett line to 30 zones by the end of 1941. Each zone would be equipped with 1 Würzburg radar, 1 command bunker, and 1 assigned night fighter. The deployment was still far short of the 200 radar network Kammhuber had originally proposed, but it represented progress. Telefunken was contracted to produce additional Würzburg sets, and training programs were established to prepare radar operators and ground controllers. By October 1941, 22 Himmelbett zones were operational along the Dutch, Belgian, and northern French coasts. The zones formed a discontinuous line extending from Denmark to the English Channel. British bombers entering German airspace now faced a layered defense. First, they would be detected by the coastal Würzburg radars. If they flew through a Himmelbett zone, they would be engaged by a radar-guided night fighter. If they evaded the fighter or flew between zones, they would encounter searchlight belts and flak concentrations around major cities. The system was not perfect. There were gaps in coverage, and bombers flying at very high or very low altitudes could sometimes avoid detection. But it was significantly more effective than the previous reliance on visual patrols. The operational results began to reflect the change. In September 1941, German night fighters shot down 37 British bombers. In October, they shot down 44. In November, the number rose to 58. The success rate was now approaching 3%, double the rate from earlier in the year. Canhuber's staff calculated that if the trend continued, the Luftwaffe would be inflicting unsustainable losses on Bomber Command by mid-1942. However, British intelligence had detected the presence of the Würzburg radars. In December 1941, a reconnaissance flight by a Spitfire equipped with oblique cameras photographed a Würzburg installation near Bruneval on the French coast. The photographs clearly showed the distinctive dish-shaped antenna. British scientists analyzing the images identified the device as a ground-based radar operating in the 50-centimeter wavelength band. This was a critical piece of intelligence. It meant the radar could be jammed or deceived using electronic countermeasures. It also meant the radar's operating principles could be studied if a unit could be captured. On the night of February 27, 1942, British commandos conducted a raid on the Bruneval-Würzburg site. The operation, codenamed Operation Biting, involved 120 paratroopers from the 2nd Parachute Battalion. The commandos dropped inland, assaulted the radar installation, dismantled key components of the Würzburg set, and evacuated by sea. The raid lasted less than 2 hours. German defenders killed 2 British soldiers and wounded several others, but the commandos successfully extracted critical parts of the radar, including the transmitter, receiver, and control electronics. These components were transported to Britain and analyzed by the Telecommunications Research Establishment, the British equivalent of Germany's radar development programs. The Bruneval raid had 2 immediate consequences. First, it provided British scientists with detailed knowledge of the Würzburg's operating characteristics, enabling them to develop jamming equipment specifically designed to disrupt the radar's frequency band. Second, it confirmed to the British that Germany was deploying radar-guided night defenses, and that these defenses posed a growing threat to Bomber Command operations. The British response was to accelerate their own development of electronic warfare systems and to modify bomber tactics to counter the Himmelbett line. Canhuber learned of the Bruneval raid within hours of its completion. He immediately recognized the implications. The British now had access to the Würzburg's design and could develop countermeasures. He submitted an urgent report to Luftwaffe High Command recommending 3 actions. First, increase the number of Himmelbett zones to provide redundant coverage and reduce the effectiveness of jamming. Second, develop improved radar systems operating on different frequencies to stay ahead of British countermeasures. Third, expand the deployment of airborne radars like the Liechtenstein set, which operated independently of ground-based systems and could not be jammed from a distance. The response was again limited approval. Canhuber was authorized to expand the Himmelbett line to 60 zones by mid-1942, but he was denied the resources for a full 200 radar network. Göring remained skeptical of the strategic value of defensive radar and continued to prioritize offensive operations, particularly in support of the Eastern Front where Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. The majority of the Luftwaffe's aircraft, pilots, and ground crew were committed to operations in Russia, leaving the night fighter force chronically under-resourced. Despite the resource constraints, the Himmelbett system continued to produce results. By April 1942, 52 zones were operational, and German night fighters were shooting down an average of 70 British bombers per month. The success rate had climbed to nearly 4%. Canhuber's analysis suggested that if this rate could be sustained and increased, Bomber Command would be forced to reduce the scale and frequency of its raids, potentially abandoning the night bombing campaign altogether. But the British adapted. In May 1942, RAF Bomber Command introduced a new tactic called the bomber stream. Instead of flying individual routes with bombers spread across the night sky, all aircraft would follow a single concentrated path to the target. The stream would be timed so that hundreds of bombers passed through a narrow corridor in a short period, typically 1 to 2 hours. This tactic saturated the Himmelbett zones. Each zone could only engage one bomber at a time because it had only one radar and one assigned fighter. When 300 bombers flew through a zone in 90 minutes, the radar could track dozens of them, but the single fighter could only intercept 1 or 2. The rest passed through unengaged. The first large-scale use of the bomber stream occurred during Operation Millennium, the 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne on the night of May 30, 1942. RAF Bomber Command assembled 1,047 aircraft for the attack, including bombers from training units and reserve squadrons. The force flew a concentrated route over the Netherlands, passing through 7 Himmelbett zones in rapid succession. German radar operators tracked the incoming stream and directed their fighters to intercept, but the sheer number of targets overwhelmed the system. German night fighters shot down 40 bombers that night, a significant number in absolute terms but only 3.8% of the attacking force. Over 600 bombers reached Cologne and dropped approximately 1,500 tons of bombs, causing extensive damage to the city's industrial and residential areas. Kammhuber recognized immediately that the bomber stream had neutralized the effectiveness of the Himmelbett line. A defensive system designed to engage individual bombers could not cope with concentrated formations passing through quickly. He submitted another report to Luftwaffe High Command, this time proposing a fundamental redesign of the night defense network. Instead of single radar zones with one fighter, he recommended multi-radar zones with multiple fighters and improved coordination between adjacent zones to allow tracking of bomber streams across long distances. He also proposed the creation of dedicated night fighter wings equipped with larger numbers of aircraft and stationed at forward bases near the coast. The response was the same. Limited resources. Competing priorities. The Eastern Front demanded the majority of the Luftwaffe's attention. Göring was still reluctant to acknowledge the strategic threat posed by British night bombing, and he continued to believe that aggressive offensive action was the solution to air defense. In June 1942, Göring removed Kammhuber from direct command of 12 Fliegerkorps and reassigned him to an administrative role overseeing night fighter development. The official reason was to allow Kammhuber to focus on long-term planning, but the practical effect was to reduce his influence over operational decisions. The numbers over the next year told the story Kammhuber had predicted. In 1942, RAF Bomber Command flew over 30,000 sorties against German targets and lost approximately 1,400 aircraft. The loss rate was 4.7%. This was significant but not unsustainable for the British, who were producing bombers faster than they were losing them. German night fighters accounted for the majority of these losses, but the Himmelbett system had reached its operational limit. Without expansion to the scale Kammhuber had originally proposed, the system could not keep pace with the growing size and sophistication of British raids. In 1943, the situation worsened. RAF Bomber Command introduced new 4-engine heavy bombers, the Avro Lancaster and Handley Page Halifax, which carried larger bomb loads and had longer range than earlier aircraft. The British also deployed window, strips of aluminum foil dropped from bombers to create false radar returns and obscure the true position of the attacking force. Window was devastatingly effective against the Würzburg radars. On the night of July 24, 1943, during the first raid of Operation Gamara against Hamburg, British bombers dropped tons of window as they approached the city. German radar operators reported that their screens were filled with thousands of contacts, making it impossible to distinguish real bombers from chaff. That night, only 12 bombers were shot down out of a force of 791. The success rate had dropped to 1.5%. Kammhuber's warnings had been vindicated, but too late. The Luftwaffe's night fighter force continued to fight throughout 1943 and 1944, achieving notable successes and inflicting heavy losses on individual raids. But the strategic initiative had passed to the British. By 1944, American bombers were conducting daylight raids while the RAF bombed at night, subjecting German cities and industrial centers to around-the-clock bombardment. The Himmelbett system, which might have been the foundation of an effective defense if deployed at the scale Kammhuber proposed in 1940, had become one component of a patchwork defensive network that struggled to cope with overwhelming numbers and technological countermeasures. The final assessment of the Würzburg radar and the Himmelbett system came after the war, when historians and military analysts examined German records and interviewed surviving commanders. The consensus was clear. The technology worked. The tactical doctrine was sound. The system had proven effective in controlled deployments. What failed was not the radar or the concept, but the decision-making process that delayed and limited its implementation. Göring's refusal to accept the strategic threat posed by British night bombing, his preference for offensive over defensive operations, and his reluctance to invest in unproven technology had prevented the Luftwaffe from deploying a defensive network that might have forced the British to abandon or drastically reduce their bombing campaign. The numbers supported this conclusion. From November 1940 to May 1942, the period when Kammhuber was actively pushing for expanded radar deployment, German night fighters achieved a success rate that gradually climbed from less than 1% to approximately 4%. This increase correlated directly with the expansion of the Himmelbett line from 0 to 60 zones. Had the deployment continued to the 200 radar network Kammhuber originally proposed, analysts estimated that the success rate could have reached 8 to 10% by late 1942. At that rate, Bomber Command's losses would have approached 20% on individual raids, a threshold historically associated with unsustainable operations. The British might have been forced to suspend night bombing until they developed effective countermeasures, delaying the strategic bombing campaign by months or even years. Instead, the limited deployment allowed the British to adapt, to develop countermeasures like window, and to implement tactics like the bomber stream that exploited the system's weaknesses. By the time the Luftwaffe recognized the need for a comprehensive radar network, the resources required for such a project were no longer available. German industry was under increasing pressure from Allied bombing, the Eastern Front was consuming vast quantities of equipment and manpower, and the strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where defensive radar networks were a secondary concern. The Würzburg radar itself remained in service throughout the war. By 1944, thousands of Würzburg sets had been produced and deployed not only for night fighter control but also for flak artillery direction and coastal defense. The technology was refined and improved. Later variants, such as the Würzburg Reese with its 7.5-meter dish replaced by a larger antenna array, could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 70 kilometers. But these improvements came too late to alter the course of the air war. The British and Americans had overwhelming numerical superiority, multiple layers of electronic countermeasures, and a production capacity that allowed them to absorb losses that would have crippled a smaller force. General Joseph Camhuber survived the war and was captured by British forces in May 1945. During interrogation, he was asked about the night fighter campaign and the Himmelbett system. He stated that the Luftwaffe had possessed the technology and the tactical knowledge to establish an effective defense against British night bombing as early as 1941. What it had lacked was the institutional will to prioritize defensive systems over offensive operations. He expressed frustration that his proposals had been repeatedly rejected or diluted, and he believed that the decision to deny him the resources for a full-scale radar network had been one of the critical strategic mistakes of the German air war. Camhuber's assessment was echoed by other German officers and engineers involved in radar development. In post-war interviews, they consistently pointed to the delay in deploying the Würzburg network as a failure of leadership rather than technology. The radar worked as designed. The problem was that the leadership denied it worked, or at least denied that it mattered, until the operational situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. The historical lesson is straightforward. Technology alone does not determine outcomes in warfare. Decisions about when and how to deploy technology, about resource allocation and strategic priorities, matter as much as the capabilities of the technology itself. The Würzburg radar was a functional, effective system that could have significantly impacted the air war over Germany. But it required institutional support, adequate resources, and timely deployment at sufficient scale. These were denied, not because they were impossible, but because the leadership believed other approaches were more important. The numbers did not lie. From 1940 to 1945, RAF Bomber Command flew over 350,000 sorties against German targets and lost approximately 8,000 aircraft. The majority of these losses occurred after the introduction of radar-guided night fighters. The aircraft that were shot down represented tens of thousands of trained aircrew killed or captured, billions of dollars in industrial production lost, and a sustained threat to German civilian morale and industrial capacity. A defensive radar network deployed at the scale Camhuber proposed in 1940 could not have stopped the bombing entirely, but it could have made it significantly more costly for the British, potentially delaying or altering the course of the campaign. Instead, the Luftwaffe fought a reactive battle throughout the war, constantly adapting to new British tactics and technologies but never achieving the strategic position that effective early deployment of radar might have provided. The Würzburg radar was denied not because it failed, but because the leadership failed to recognize what the numbers were saying. By the time they did, it was too late. This is one of many forgotten stories from World War II where the technology was available, the doctrine was sound, and the opportunity existed, but institutional decisions prevented success. If you found this account valuable, consider subscribing to stay informed about similar historical analyses. History is not just about what happened, but about understanding why decisions were made and what their consequences were. Thank you for listening.